With the luck of the lottery, I get a second chance to ask you about this report.
At least one of us is lucky.
Minister, exactly. The big phenomena that the report identifies is uncommenced apartments, right? That the number of apartment complexes that are getting planning permission way exceeds the number that are actually built. What are you going to do about that?
Thanks again, Deputy. With respect to your question, housing policy is written for the Minister by Oireachtas staff in deeper, carry out research in broad ranges of areas affecting expenditure. While this informs the evidence base that is provided by the officials in ministerial briefings, housing policy is developed and implemented by the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. The Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service is an integrated cross-government service which seeks to enhance the role of analysis and evidence-based policy making, and the two housing analytical notes published last December are independent pieces of research conducted by them in the department. Oireachtas staff in deeper regularly undertake research producing papers, as I said already. The Planning Permissions and Housing Supply note seeks to broaden the evidence base underpinning the planning process by examining refusal rates, decision times and planning appeals using available data. It also discusses the relationship between planning permissions and recent trends in housing supply, more broadly drawing on available data as well as existing research and literature in the topic. A key finding from the research highlights the need for improved quality of planning data and for further research to be conducted to provide clear insights on the planning processes and impacts on commencements and delivery. And the second note examines the activity and take-up of Rebuilding Ireland Home Loan, which I've already said the findings highlighted the strong demand that is there. All of the work carried out by them within the department forms an evidence base which the officials use to brief the Minister. All papers are publicly available and published by them on the website, and any member of the government or public can view them and its findings, and the Minister fully supports the transparency, going back to Deputy O'Connell's point, that allows members of the public, stakeholders and the government to access the pieces of research and analysis carried out on his behalf. All research and analysis papers carried out by Oireachtas, including work prepared by them and by the staff in the department, while used to inform policymakers, are independent and do not necessarily represent the ministerial policy view nor the position of the department or the government. This independence is an important pillar in its contribution to an evidence-based policy making situation.
Okay, so you've just read out the same note that you read out about 10 minutes ago.
And you asked the same question.
No, I didn't. And the transcript will show that I'm trying to develop the argument and you're just stonewalling here because you don't want to acknowledge the fundamental point, and this is evidence. It's not just somebody's opinion, their political policy. It's evidence produced by your department, and what it shows is there is no problem getting planning permissions for housing, for apartments, and that the number of planning permissions way exceed the number of completions by a multiple of factors, and that planning objections is not a problem. But this is what they say is probably the problem. The uncommenced units could indicate the speculative purchasing and holding of land with a view to greater future resale value. Acquiring planning permissions to hold as an asset. Acquiring permission for apartment development rather than housing developments could be the most attractive option for speculative landholders and thus yield the most amount of value added upon resale. That's what your department thinks is happening. What do you think about that?
Well, what I think is the most important line in the first part of the question, which I read out to you, and by the way, it wasn't the same reply because the questions were different. It's pity they weren't grouped together because it would have avoided me standing up a second time. However, the last part of it is the most important.
Fortuitous, I would say.
Well, maybe. The independence of the pillar and its contribution on evidence-based policy making. So it's almost like the Fiscal Advisory Council. It does provide evidence. It does provide sometimes contrarian views, but ultimately it is for the Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government to make a determination with regard to housing policy. And if, Deputy, you're saying to me that planning objections really don't make a difference, well, everyday leaders' questions, week in, week out here, we have heard of planning objections, including some in your own constituency, that people have made objections on ideological basis. Now, if you're telling me that planning objections make no impact to the delivery of housing in your area or across Dublin, sorry now, but in the real world, planning objections do make a difference because they prevent people ultimately from getting on with the job of delivering housing, which we all want.
Yeah, so in other words, the the analysis and the data collected by your department is just completely ignored by your department, and you just continue to trot out mantras without the slightest basis of evidence, because I'm afraid the evidence produced by your department shows there's no problem with planning permissions. The number of planning permissions being granted is increasing dramatically. It far exceeds the number of completions, and that the number of refusals are a tiny proportion. I mean, I was looking at, actually, just if you want to name a county, you made earlier points about rural Ireland. Let me take Longford. 10% refusal rate, 1,747. In fact, there were more planning applications in Longford than there were in most of the Dublin counties. So your point about urban-rural isn't even correct, right? It's just not true. But you keep saying it. Now, you have to ask, if they think speculators are really the ones who are determining things, then what the government's policy is actually doing is simply articulating the views of the speculators.
In fairness to you, you do get away with a lot of things in here, but to compare the planning processes that are currently in train in Longford with those in Dublin, where the majority of the housing, if you just let me finish, where the majority of the planning applications, I would imagine, in Longford are for one-off houses or small schemes. You are comparing bananas to pineapples. There is no comparison. But if you want to look at the Greater Dublin area, and I know you didn't want to refer to this, the counties in the Greater Dublin area and those containing large urban centres tended to have the highest levels of refusals, and refusal rates across local authorities range from 37% in Kildare to 4% in Tipperary. And I would imagine, without going through the data, because it's my neighbouring county, that the vast majority of the planning applications in County Tipperary are one-off houses. Now, if you think that the planning process and the planning situation and the housing situation in Dublin can be solved with one-off houses, you are deluded, because the overall rate of refusal across all of the report is 15%. Now, you said that's a tiny number. That's an enormous number if you take into consideration that each one of those planning applications, because it's only 15% of the planning applications, not the number of units. And I know that you're proficient in relation to objections, but the numbers of units that are being opposed to is enormous.
Thank you, Minister.
Well, it's sort of our... Oh, is that...
We're finished.
Oh, we're finished?
Yeah.
Two bites, not three. Yeah. Well, it rests with the department to group the questions. Yeah.